Okay, now last week we started looking at chapter 11, verses 2 through 16, and more specifically, we were looking at the first paragraph of that section, which is chapter 11, verses 2 through 6. In verse 2, Paul praises the church there, the leaders in Corinth, because they were holding fast to the tradition or the teaching that he had passed on to them. So they had held the line against some pressure to deviate from that tradition that Paul had passed on to them. And for that reason, Paul praises them. And then he proceeds to flesh out that teaching that he had previously passed on to them, that they were holding firm in. He fleshes that out to help them in dealing with the current challenge. He's fortifying that teaching. Okay, or fleshing it out to fortify their position so they'll be better suited to defend it. And he begins that in verse 3. Now, we went through this last week, so I'm just kind of getting us back up to speed. He begins in verse 3 by denying the notion that sex or gender, maleness and femaleness, that's completely irrelevant in the church. And he does that by pointing out that there's a difference between the sexes regarding leadership. Whereas every man is under the headship of Christ, man is not under the headship of woman. Rather, it's woman who's under the headship of the man. And Christ himself is under the headship of God the Father. And so the fact that man has a distinctive leadership role in relation to the woman means that gender continues to matter. Its significance has not been obliterated in the inaugurated kingdom of Christ. Now, I suggested to you at the end of the last class that headship or leadership responsibility, that was put on men by God in the beginning. That was something done there. I said this is indicated in a number of ways in Scripture. The first way that it's indicated in Scripture is that God created man first. You see that in Genesis chapter 2, verses 20 and 21. And you say, well, how does that indicate that God is putting the leadership responsibility on the man, the fact that he created the man first? Well, the leadership right of the firstborn is all over the Old Testament. And it was taken for granted in the first century. So by creating man first, God was signaling his intention to put the leadership responsibility on the man. So I went through that last week. Let's pick back up there. Other reasons why you can conclude that God put the leadership responsibility on the man in the beginning, it's indicated by the fact the woman is described in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, and Genesis chapter 2, verse 20, as a helper fit or suitable for Adam. Now, it's true. When you say that, people say, well, helper is applied to God. And that's true, that that same word, helper, is applied to God. But the word, just by itself, doesn't say anything about the kind of helper intended. Sure, you can have a helper like God, but that's not the only kind of helper. So you have to look to the context to say what kind of helper is envisioned here in the text. And in that regard, you see John Piper and Wayne Grudem. They say the context must decide whether Eve is to help as a strong person who aids a weaker one, or as one who assists a loving leader. The context makes it very unlikely that helper should be read on the analogy of God's help, because in Genesis 2, 19 and 20, Adam is caused to seek his helper first among the animals. But the animals will not do because they're not fit for him. So God makes woman from man. Now there's a being who's fit for him, sharing his human nature, equal to him in godlike personhood. She's infinitely different from an animal, and God highlights her value to man by showing how no animal can fill her role. Yet in passing through helpful animals to woman, God teaches us that the woman is a man's helper in the sense of a loyal and suitable assistant in the life of the garden. So she's created as the helper or the assistant for Adam. And other indications of male leadership from the beginning include the fact that the instructions about not eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they were given to the man in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. You see other indications. The fact the man named the woman in Genesis chapter 2, verse 23. And the fact the serpent subverted male leadership by approaching Eve in Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. And so all of that fits with Paul's statement when Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34, which we'll get to, he says that women in Christian assemblies are obligated to be in submission as even the law says. You see, so we have the Spirit of God through Paul indicating that the law puts the leadership responsibility on men. Okay, so I think that's what's indicated here, and that's what's true. Now, I say this all the time because when you say that, I understand that women get antsy about it, right? Saying, what is this deal here? And I always say, look, the fact that men are to lead and women are to be the non-leading partner, they're to be the helping partner in the joint enterprise of glorifying God, it does not mean, it does not imply that women are inferior in character, in intellect, in value, or in capability. It doesn't imply that at all. It means only that God, in His sovereignty and for His purpose, He chose to put the responsibility on the man. Okay? That's what it means. He chose to put the responsibility on the man. And as God made clear in Korah's rebellion, in Numbers chapter 16. In fact, he made dramatically clear there. He has the right to choose select groups for specific roles. They were objecting to that in Numbers 16. And you know how that turned out. He has a right, God has a right to limit roles to people based on the group into which they were born. He has a right to do that. He's not obligated to grant everyone equal access to roles based on their ability. That's our notion. That there's something wrong with if you have a position, you have to open up and let everybody compete for it on the basis of their ability. God doesn't have to do that. You see, He doesn't have to do that. You might just as well challenge His right to give the tribe of Levi the exclusive responsibility for caring for the tabernacle. Right? God says, I'm going to put that responsibility on the Levites. Why don't you say, wait a minute, how can you do that? Why don't you find out what they're going to be doing, and then we'll have Levite tryouts or tabernacle tryouts. We'll see who's best at it, and then we'll pick the best people. And if you don't do that, there's something wrong. No. He has a right to pick select groups for specific roles. He has the right, for example, to give the family of Aaron the exclusive responsibility of serving as priest. Now, that a submissive or a non-leading role, that does not mean or does not imply inferior status. I mean, that's evident, isn't it, in the case of Jesus? Right? Jesus is the God-man. He's one in nature, being, and essence with the Father. So the Son is not inferior to or less worthy than the Father, yet He is functionally subordinate to the Father. He willingly, joyfully submits to the Father's authority. He submits to the Father's leadership. This is made explicit here. He says, and the head of Christ is God. And it's demonstrated all throughout the New Testament. The difference between the Father and the Son isn't a matter of ontology. It isn't a matter of nature or essence or being. It's not that at all. It's a matter of role or function. And the Son freely embraces the leadership of the Father. Now, if Jesus, being in very nature God, if he can submit to the Father's authority, then certainly women can submit to the leadership right of men without denying their equal dignity and value. Right? It's not something you say, well, I'm a lesser thing. You're not. You're simply fulfilling a different role. And in doing that, they're acting like Christ. Thomas Schreiner, he says, a difference in role or function in no way implies that women are inferior to men. Even the Son submits to the Father, and yet he's equal to the Father in essence, dignity, and personhood. It is a modern democratic Western notion that diverse functions suggest distinctions in worth between men and women. Paul believed that men and women were equal in personhood, dignity, and value, but he also taught that women had distinct roles from men. Now, I think it is helpful and it is humbling for us men to understand that our leadership role, understand that that responsibility is not an indication of superior ability. It's not an indication of superior ability, but it is a role, a responsibility that has been placed on us by God in his sovereignty. Right? Just as you should not conclude from the fact that Levites were given the exclusive responsibility of carrying tabernacle furniture. Only they could carry the tabernacle furniture. That responsibility was placed on them and only on them. So you should not conclude from that therefore they were the best at furniture lugging in all of Israel. You see, that's a non sequitur. They can be given the responsibility for different reasons. And I'm just saying, from our side, man, we have to be careful to think because the responsibility's been given to you, that means that I'm all that. You see, that means that I'm all that, you see. So husbands, for example, should not conclude from the fact that we are given the leadership responsibility in the home, that we therefore must be the most capable at that task. Right? And that's how I'm afraid sometimes we do. We think, look, the leadership responsibility is mine, therefore I am the best at it. I know more about it. I've been given this role, and therefore that means that your input, dear wife, is minimal. You see, that is a terrible mistake. See, the election to these responsibilities, as I say, it is not merit-based, but is tribe-based in the case of the Levites, and it's sex-based in the case of husbands. And if we don't understand that as husbands, and we get puffed up, then what happens is it makes us poorer leaders, because when we get an inflated view that because I've been given this responsibility, that therefore means I'm superior at it, well, we make poorer decisions because we neglect the wisdom and the insight of our wife. You know, I know best. So what do I need to have you as a partner for? And so what are you doing? That you're sacrificing you are given a responsibility to lead the family in a God-glorifying direction, and because you're puffed up with this false notion, you shut off a part that would help you be a better leader. So you become a worse servant of God in doing that. Right? And so I just think that's important. It does not follow from the fact, this is another thing that I think needs to be hit, it doesn't follow from the fact that male leadership is rooted in creation, that women are barred from having authority over men in all spheres. You see, including business, education, and politics. Scripture indicates the contrary. We have to let God inform us of what does it mean that you've placed the leadership responsibility on men. And Scripture indicates that He does not oppose women leading men in all spheres. And you see that in the case of Deborah. Right? Deborah is a judge in Israel. with God's blessing. She is a judge in Israel, and she's one as a judge to whom the people come to have their disputes decided and settled. You see that in Judges chapter 4, verse 5. So that means that some civil or administrative authority had been vested in her, to make these decisions. So we have two men who have a dispute, and they come to the judge, and she rules and has the authority to decide the case. No problem. You see? No problem there. So the issue is not whether God always forbids women from exercising authority over men in every context, but whether God desires His choice of male leadership that was expressed in and from creation to be acknowledged and honored in the church and in the home in the manner He's indicated. So we have to sit here and look and say, well, how do you want us to honor your election of men as the leaders? How does that play out in the church, and how does that play out in home? And that's what we're to search for and to understand. See, He is free to define. He's free to define how He wants the difference between the sexes, how He wants that to be manifested in the world, in the church, and in our assemblies. So we have to be sensitive to the differing situations and circumstances as we're trying to understand, what would you have us do, Lord? How are we to be in a way that honors you? Now, in saying that Christ is head of every man, he says here, the head of every man is Christ. I think Paul means that Christ is the head of man in a distinctive sense. He is the head of man in a sense in which He is not the head of woman. Specifically, because God in the beginning placed the leadership responsibility on the man in relation to the woman, Christ's headship of the woman is in some ways and to some extent, that headship is expressed through the headship of the man. Whereas Christ's headship over the man is not expressed through a headship of the woman. So when he sits here and he makes it, every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, he's making a distinction. I think that distinction is that because there is this leadership right on the part of the man, that in some ways, to some extent, in some ways, that Christ's headship is expressed over the woman in the leadership of the man, and that's not reciprocal, because the woman is not the head of man. I think that's what Paul is saying there. And similarly, God the Father, right? He's the head of Christ in a distinctive sense. The Father is head of Christ in a way in which He is not the head of man. And I think that it's the same situation. You see, the Father's headship of man is expressed through the headship of the perfect Son, Christ. And I think it's helpful to remember that Paul he's framing leadership here in terms of headship, referring to a literal head and the metaphorical meaning of headship. He's doing that because head plays into the specific issue he's addressing. There was a problem that had perked up. They had pressed against the leaders. The leaders held firm to the tradition Paul had passed on to them. And now they're asking Paul to speak on this matter. So it played the issue, so he uses the headship because it plays into the issue that he's dealing with, which involves covering of the head. A literal covering of the head. So that's why I think he frames leadership in terms of headship. Here's what Champa and Rossner say in their commentary. If some Corinthians were arguing that Christ, as head of the church, was head over men and women in the same way, since in the new creation there's no longer any male and female, Paul seems to be affirming that the creation pattern is still significant and cannot be shrugged off. Man first, leadership there. You can't simply ignore that. He says, while there's tension between creation and new creation, especially fallen creation and new creation, Creation is the context in which Christians live out their lives, and it cannot be passed off as irrelevant. You see, that's what I think is going on here. You have this idea in Corinth that has taken hold among some that sexual distinctions are irrelevant in the inaugurated kingdom. And I think that's what's behind this push to discard the head covering when praying. Now, Paul and the Corinthians, when we look at this, this is a difficult text, right? You scratch your head and wrestle with it. But Paul and the Corinthians, see, they knew the covering problem. They knew what was going on, what the issue was. They knew the covering problem, and they also knew the traditions that Paul had previously passed on to them. And the leaders had resisted deviating from those traditions in the face of the covering problem, and therefore were commended by Paul. So in what Paul says, you see, there's a lot of underlying knowledge inside baseball that's taken for granted, because they're fully aware of the situation. They know the problem. They know what Paul had said before. You see? So they know that, and you have a lot in what Paul says. He takes certain things for granted, and that makes his meaning less clear to those of us who don't have the benefit of that knowledge, especially those of us who are so far removed linguistically and culturally. So we're back here kind of digging around trying to say, what are you talking about? You see, what are you talking about? And I'm giving you my best understanding of it, right? And I was talking to somebody last week. I said, what I want to do is, if I'm saying something that you say, God, I think he's crazy about that, just try to relax and listen to why I understand it the way I do. Take a deep breath, put aside, and don't start blocking everything, because you won't understand what I'm saying. So once you understand what I think and why, all right, now once you've heard me, then okay, have at it. You sit there and say, well, I think that's not right. Okay, I work at this to give you the best I have. And so, but I at least want you to hear what I'm saying. Why? Because I have not arrived at this lightly. Okay, I didn't pick up the book this morning and come in to talk to you. You can be sure about that. Okay, in verses 4 and 5, Paul speaks of men praying or prophesying. He simply says, having upon the head, or having down on the head. Okay, he speaks of of men praying or prophesying, having upon the head, and women praying or prophesying uncovered as to the head. He doesn't specify, he doesn't identify what was or was not upon the head. Now, presumably that's because it was understood that he was referring to the covering that was the subject of the current controversy, the subject regarding which they had held firm and therefore earned his praise, and the subject about which they had communicated with him, saying, what is the right thing on this? Okay, so I think he doesn't identify it for that reason. Now, some take this to mean that Paul was addressing two separate problems related to head covering. Okay, that he was addressing one problem involving men and head covering, and another problem involving women and head covering. But I am among those who think that is a misunderstanding. Okay, I don't think he's addressing two separate problems. I'm persuaded that only one problem was being addressed, which was women who were seeking to remove or discard the culturally expected female head covering when praying in the assembly. I think that was the issue. That is expressly identified as the issue in chapter 11, verse 13, where Paul, he sums up what he says, judge among yourselves. Okay, he's kind of summarizing what is at stake here. What are we talking about? Judge among yourselves, is it proper that a woman pray to God uncovered? That's the question. That's the issue that is causing all the hubbub. and that Paul is addressing. Now, as part of his response to that issue, whether it's proper that a woman pray to God uncovered, in response to that, Paul gives a hypothetical of men wearing that covering, wearing the female head covering. And he does that because all would agree that for men to do that would be a disgraceful thing. It would be a disgraceful thing for a man to don a woman's head covering. And so they would all agree to that. And from that, he wants them to recognize that it is, you see then that it is equally disgraceful for a woman to dress like a man by discarding the culturally expected female head covering. It's two sides of the same gender-bending coin. Okay? Only one of them is happening. And that it's gender-bending, that's why it's a matter of disgrace. Right? When he sits there and says, if he has it, he disgraces his head. It's a matter of disgrace because it involves gender bending. Only one is actually happening. He gives the other as a hypothetical to help them understand what is wrong with the practice that they are encouraging or promoting. Gordon Fee, in his commentary, he says, Paul, so I'm talking about now, is it two issues or one? I'm telling you, in my view, it's one, and the men are talked about simply as a hypothetical to get them to see the error of the actual practice in question. This is what Gordon Fee says. Paul seems to be setting up his argument with the women by means of a hypothetical situation for the man that would be equally shameful to his relationship to his head as what the women are doing to theirs. Right? So just as it would be disgraceful for a Christian man to wear a female head covering, it is disgraceful for a Christian woman to speak publicly to or on behalf of God without that covering, in other words, attired as a man, by having discarded the covering. Richard Hayes, in his commentary, he says, some of the Corinthians had enthusiastically embraced the early Christian tradition that in Christ there is no male and female. You remember I mentioned Galatians 3:28, where how you could get that wrong idea from what Paul says there. He says, and they were seeking to transcend their sexuality. In keeping with this tendency, the Corinthian women who were removing their head covering in worship were consciously discarding a traditional marker of gender distinction. I think that's right. I think that's what's going on. And that the actual problem being addressed was women wanting to or praying uncovered, that was the problem. It's indicated by the fact that Paul, in verses 5 through 10, he disproportionately focuses on the reasons why the women are to be covered and the fact that he commands the woman at the end of verse 6 to cover her head. Whereas there's no comparable command or imperative directed toward the men. And most importantly, as I already pointed out, when he specifies the issue he's addressing, in chapter 11, verse 13, he says, judge among yourselves, is it proper that a woman pray to God uncovered? So I'm convinced that's what the issue is. Joseph Fitzmyer, in his commentary, he says, the problem is not that Corinthian men were praying or prophesying with covered heads, even though Paul's rhetorical comparison leads him to formulate it so in order to make his point by contrast. It is important not to confuse rhetoric with the substance of the argument. And so I think that's what Paul is doing. Now, Fitzmyer, he cites in his commentary many commentators who agree with this. Okay, so I'm not the Lone Ranger. There are many who would disagree, but I'm not the Lone Ranger. Fitzmyer cites Bruce, Conzelman, Garland, Groscheid, Kremer, Leitzman, and many others. And I could add to those that he cites in his commentary, I could add James Hurley, Benjamin Edsel, Gordon Fee, and William Loader. Okay, so it's not a quirky thing that I'm telling you. Okay, I always like to say it's not eccentric. There's a large group of serious commentators who take this view that I'm presenting to you. Now, there's good reason to believe that Greek, Roman, and Jewish women in the first century, Greek, Roman, and Jewish women in the first century were expected to wear some kind of covering on their heads when they went in public. Okay, which would include Christian assemblies. Right? Even where Christians met in homes, which practice was not as extensive and exclusive as we sometimes think, there being many non-house settings that would have been plausible places for them to meet. But even where Christians met in homes, Elif Karaman says in her 2018 book, Ephesian Women in Greco-Roman and Early Christian Perspective, she says, even though one's house is a private domain, during Christian gatherings, this private domain would be transformed into a public or semi-public space. Choosing whether or not to cover your head at a church gathering, therefore, involved a consideration of how you would be perceived publicly. And so I'm saying to you that there's good reason to believe that Greek women and Jewish women all were expected to have some kind of cover on their head when they were in public, and that the church gathering would qualify as being in public. Okay, and I think that's what's going on. And so because those coverings were a culturally expected piece of female attire, they functioned then in the Mediterranean world as a traditional marker of femaleness, a marker of gender distinction. In his 1986, in an article in 1986, New Testament scholar David Lowry, he said, it cannot be unequivocally asserted. There's very little that can be unequivocally asserted, okay? But he says, but the preponderance of evidence points toward the public head covering of women as a universal custom in the first century in both Jewish culture and Greco-Roman culture. The nature of the covering varied considerably, but it was commonly a portion of the outer garment, himation, drawn up over the head like a hood. Now, many dispute that. Okay, I think it's right. But this is in 1986 when he wrote this, and many dispute that. But there has been a significant amount of subsequent scholarship that supports what he's saying. And several months ago, I put a paper on my website, and that paper is titled Expectations Regarding Female Head Covering in Greek, Roman, and Jewish Cultures of the First Century. And it's just 12 pages, but it's loaded with modern scholarship supporting this idea. Okay? If you're more, I just didn't want to break out and have an extended footnote and go through all this and demonstrate all this to you. So I'm telling you how I see it, and if you're more interested in why I see it that way, go and read that paper where I have the sources there. Here, the image on the left, this is a figurine from about 300 BC of a Greek woman wearing what is known as a himation. And you see it's this garment, you see how it's draped over her head. And the image on the right, that's a statue that's dated to around AD 25. Now, Paul's writing this in about AD 54. Okay, so we're right here in the cultural time. So this is a Roman woman wearing what is known as a pallium. And you see it's very similar to the himation, but it's a pallium, and that's a garment that in prior centuries was referred to as a palla. Okay, but by the first century BC, in the latter half of the first century BC and into the first century, it was known as a pallium. Oh, so that's an image there. Now, women in ancient Greece, they had more than one option, right, of covering their heads. They could drape this himation over their head. They could do that. Or they could wear a separate piece of material. They could wear a separate piece of material like a large scarf, just loosely upon the head. And there likewise were options other than the pallium for Roman women. They could use to cover their heads. Most notably, there's a scarf known as a palliolum. And there were other things. Okay, so I'm just saying that there were options for this, and it was, as I understand it, through a lot of digging and reading, I think that it was culturally expected for Greek, Roman, and Jewish women to have something on your head in public in the first century. Now that's significant, right? That's significant because the covering was a standard item of female dress. If you take it off, if you take that off in first century Greco-Roman culture, well, that would then be to dress like a man. You would be dressing like a man. The classicist or classical scholar, a classicist or a classical scholar is someone whose focus of study is the ancient Greco-Roman society and culture. Okay, so the classicist, Lloyd Llewellyn Jones, he says in his book, Aphrodite's Tortoise, which, by the way, a fellow classicist, Kelly Olson, says of Llewellyn Jones's book, describes it as a masterful study. Now, he says in that book, so whatever the makeup of the women of the Christian assembly at Corinth, Greek, Roman, or even Jewish, their uncovered heads would have broken with a number of social conventions and appeared as anathema to Paul. Okay? This is what I think is the context for what's going on. And that the issue with the covering, was in fact one of gender distinction. It's indicated in the second part of verse 5 and in verse 6. Paul declares that there he says, every woman who prays or prophesies with an uncovered head, he says, disgraces her head. She prays with an uncovered head, she disgraces her head. Why? Why does she disgrace her head? And he says, because, right? She disgraces her head, for a woman without a head covering is just like a woman who's had her head shaved. Okay, well that's the clue. Right? That it is a gender distinction is involved with this head covering, because to not have it is to be just like a woman who has had her head shaved. And verse 6 emphasizes the closeness of the parallel. And a woman with a shaved head, or a head with very short hair, that woman was shameful in that culture because she was wearing her hair like a man. Okay? You say, why do you think that? Why do you think in that culture that her super short hair or a shaved head would be wearing the head like a man? Well, we have a couple of writings from a Greek satirist in the 2nd century named Lucian, who leaves no doubt about short hair on a woman being understood to be mannish. Okay, in that culture. The New Testament scholar James B. DeYoung, he comments, he says, the shame seems related to a woman's becoming like a man in her style of hair becoming mannish. This suggests that the women at Corinth were blurring distinctions between men and women, especially sexual distinctions. Gordon Fee, in his commentary, says the shame of a woman having her hair cut short or her head shaved seems clearly related to her becoming like a man with regard to her hair. Thus, by analogy, suggesting that the women were blurring male-female relationships in general and sexual distinctions in particular. Now, Fee says in his commentary, he says, the force of the statement, if a woman does not cover herself, then let her also be shorn or shaved. He says the force of that statement is, quote, let her go the whole way to shame by having her hair like a man's. Nigel Watson, in his commentary, says Paul now reinforces the rule just laid down for the behavior of women. If a woman prays or prophesies bareheaded, it is as bad as if her head were shaved, and that is implied by verse 6, and that it is implied by verse 6 is generally recognized as something shameful. But why should it be shameful? There are passages in the 2nd century writer Lucian which show that short hair on a woman was considered mannish in that culture. It was considered mannish. That appears to be the point. And then more recently, Jennifer Nust says in her work, says, therefore, when Paul stated that men ought never to wear hair long and women ought never to wear hair short, the maintenance of gender difference was clearly a primary concern. Now, the shame. So he says, if you come off with the cover, it's just like having your head shaven, it's shameful. He says it's a matter of gender distinction. Why is it shameful? It's shameful because shaved or short hair in that culture was hair like a man. So therefore, if you take the head covering off, it's the same thing. It's appearing as a man. And that's what's wrong with it. Now, her shame was not from the short hair itself. There is nothing inherently or intrinsically masculine about the short hair. See, that wasn't what it was about. It was culturally defined as the hair of a man. And cultures can be different about that. But this Mediterranean world, the Greco-Roman Jewish world, this is how this was. You see, it was defined there at that time as the hair of a man. And in the same way, the shame of going uncovered was not from the attire itself, but from the fact the lack of a cover was culturally defined as the attire of a man. You see, it's not intrinsic. So you can't simply jump off and say, well then, if you have short hair anywhere, that it's sinful. That's not the point at all. The point is the thing with it covering in this particular cultural context. And he's using the short hair because that's an analogy, a cultural analogy that they would understand. Here's what Schreiner says. Paul objects to men wearing head coverings in verse 4 because such adornment would be disgraceful. Why? Because that's what women wore. And thus a man who wore such a head covering would be shamefully depicting himself as a woman. Conversely, if women do not wear head coverings, their failure to be adorned properly would be shameful because they would be dressing like men. That the shame involved is due to appearing like a man is confirmed by Paul's explanation in 5b and 6. A woman's failure to wear a head covering is analogous to her having her hair cut short or shaved. Every woman in the culture of that day would have been ashamed of appearing in public with her head shaved or her hair cut short, because then she would have looked like a man. Okay? Now, there are people who disagree with this. Okay? And I'm not going to have time. Next week, Lord willing, I'll get into this. There are people who say, no, he's dealing with men. And he's dealing with men because we know that Roman men threw a toga over their head and this kind of stuff. Capite volato. Okay, I'm aware of these things. I just can't say everything in one class. Okay, so I will walk through this and keep going until I get to the end, and then you can exhale and say, okay, I think I understand why this guy's saying this, how he understands it, and then you evaluate what I'm telling you. Okay, thanks for coming.